Good morning. This is CAL versus AL, where we spot the differences. My name is Joe Mathis, and the presenter is going to be Mark Brummel. And Mark, are you ready?
Hello. Yeah, I'm ready. You are going to do the housekeeping rules?
Okay, yep. Housekeeping rules. All these webinars are recorded. We're going to find them on YouTube later. Mark's going to be saving them and putting them up there. The new webinars can be also found on the NavSkills website. It's www.nav-skills.com webinars. And if you have any questions, please use the GoToWebinar question window, and we'll try to take some in line with the presentation. We'll also try to summarize them up at the end, and there will be a Q&A at the very end. And then big thanks to our sponsor for using GoToWebinar. There's another upcoming webinar. It's going to be Get 101. Presenter is going to be Camille. I can't say his last name. Sacek. And this is going to be on Thursday, November 23rd. Not a real great day, I think. Thanksgiving, right? In the U.S.
Yeah, sorry for that. But you guys are free.
That's okay.
So
we'll have off, so everybody will be able to attend. So
exactly.
Get very important. Another one that's coming up is Job Queues to the Rescue, and that'll be presented by Gino Pack and Cynthia Prieb. And that's Thursday the 30th. And then in December, we're going to get Tobias Fenster in to do some Docker, and then we're going to have another one that we haven't determined yet.
Yeah, exactly.
And
shall I take over?
Yes, please.
Yeah, let's take over. So good morning, good afternoon to everybody wherever you are. Welcome to the webinar. Let me find the slides where I can start. I want also to say good morning to Julia. Are you there, Julia?
I am. Good morning.
Good. Yeah, we had to start with the housekeeping rules in order not to delay the webinar too much.
No, that's okay. I got my time zones switched around, so but so that's fine. I'm glad we got started.
Good. So you were the one that actually requested the webinar. We talked about this at NAVOC Summit, and you said it would be a great idea to just compare traditional CL code in C-side to Visual Studio Code. So that's basically what the idea was behind this webinar. We have about 200 people as attendees. I hope that all of you guys are novices in Visual Studio Code. If you have already played around with VS Code, this is probably going to be a very boring webinar to you. But if VS Code is new to you, then this is probably going to be interesting. I'm probably also going to repeat some of the stuff that has been covered in previous webinars. But this is really to focus as a one-on-one on the differences between traditional development of NAV in CAL and new development in AL, and we'll be talking about how to convert code and to do other stuff like that. So, Julia, any questions that you have, please interrupt me. You are the only one who is able to talk to me. But if you have any questions or if anything is unclear to you, then please interrupt me and ask questions. Okay?
Yes. And the others, will they be able to type in as well?
Yeah, they will be able to type in questions.
I'll be looking for their questions as well.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So if you want to get started, how do you do that? That's one of the frequently asked questions. One of the most different or challenging tasks with this project is to keep up with Microsoft. Microsoft is releasing an update every month. And one of the big changes that Microsoft have done during the project is in the first iterations, they created a virtual machine with a product DVD, and during the summer period, Microsoft switched to Docker. If you create an Azure virtual machine from the link that you get from Microsoft, and let me actually show you that link. If you go to the NAV team blog, and you find the November update. In the November update, you'll actually find a link to aka.ms/NAV developer preview. If you click on this, you're taken to a portal from Azure, and here you can just populate some fields, and then you are good to go with a virtual machine. In the days when we had the real virtual machine with product DVD, it was actually relatively easy to install everything locally. That's very hard these days. Microsoft is also releasing CTP builds for partners. Currently, the NAV CTP build is 16, and I've actually tried to make it work on my local machine, but I actually failed because the compiler is not in sync with the CTP build. But I'm going to show you whatever I have today. In December, Tobias is going to show you how to work with Docker. Personally, for me, Docker is kind of a black box. It's not within my comfort zone just yet. So today I'm going to show you partly some stuff that works on my local machine and partly some stuff that works on Docker with an Azure virtual machine. I'm one of these guys that thinks that you have to learn to walk before you can run. I think one of the disadvantages of the Docker and the PowerShell is that everything is packaged for you, but you have no idea what you're looking at. And that's actually one of the advantages of having it on your local machine, is that you can actually work with it and see how all the elements move before you actually move to Docker. So I'm going to show you what I have on my local machine and how the elements should move. So if you have a local NAV, this is my local machine, and here I have a Seaside environment. This is a demo database version 11, so this is NAV 2018. This is CTP 2018, and if I go to the administration tool, you will see that we do have a new property that Microsoft has introduced. The property, you can find the property here at the end with development. And here it says enable developer service endpoint and enable loading application symbol reference at startup. If you enable these properties, you can actually code against a local database. And you can also create your own symbols from your customer database, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. If you do that, let me go to my next slide. If you do that, within VS Code, you can actually move the launch.json file to the local host and point it to the local server instance. And then you can change your app.json file to look at your local application. This is something that I fiddled around a little bit in CTP 16. It is scheduled to be changed in CTP 17. In CTP 16, it had to be version 11 and locale application. But in CTP 17, it will just be application without the version tag. So you can actually find this here. If you go to Visual Studio, you can actually find it in the app.json file. You can actually, this is what it should be in CTP 11. So what kind of prevented me from doing all of this on my local machine is that if I go to the extensions, you can see that my AL language is a local extension, but it's currently version 0.9, which is in sync with Dynamics 365. And in order to make everything work, you need to have version 11, which is part of the Docker image. I also have a Docker image. If I go to my virtual machine here I have my virtual machine, but if I try to start Seaside from my virtual machine, I get an error message. And the goal of this webinar was to compare Seaside to VS Code. And Seaside is not working on Docker, and VS Code is not working on my local machine. So it's going to be quite a challenge to to do this, but I'm going to show part of this stuff on my local machine with Seaside and the conversion tools, and I'm going to show part of it on the virtual machine because that's where actually the compiler works. I really hope that Microsoft fixes this before they release it in December, so that in December we can actually just install Navision from the product DVD and make everything just work like we're used to with all of that. So today we're going to compare CAL code to AL code. We're going to do that by converting code using the conversion tool. And we're just going to use simple tools like Beyond Compare to look at the differences. But before we look at the differences and similarities using Beyond Compare, let me just quickly go through some bigger differences that you can also find online, but this is just a nice PowerPoint slide where everything is just compiled as a list. One of the biggest differences that people will run into when they start with VS Code is that in Seaside you can use .NET libraries using .NET Interop, and VS Code in December, when it's released, will not have that feature. It is on the planning to get that working, but for now, in Visual Studio Code, you cannot use .NET. VS Code, however, has native web service types. We'll do a webinar about that in January. And Dimitri Katson actually showed it in his webinar in October, where he actually showed how to consume a RESTful web service using the native web service types. In Seaside, you can also fiddle around with files. You can fiddle around with files on the client side, on the server side, and with Visual Studio Code, you can only upload and download files from the stream. So file support is much more limited. Then we have smaller differences, like in Seaside, all the keywords are uppercase, if, then, else, and all the programming statements. In Visual Studio Code, you can still do that, but it's not recommended to do that. In Visual Studio Code, it's recommended to do the keywords in lower casing. In Seaside, we have Object Designer. Object Designer is allowing us to say, hey, I'm looking for the customer table. And you can just type in the customer table, and then you will hopefully find the customer table. Visual Studio Code doesn't have that, right? So we're going to have to find a different way to organize projects. Everything in Visual Studio is file-based. So you have to organize your files, and one of the most frequently used structures, of course, is to just put all the objects into containers where all the pages and tables and code units are together. I'm not quite sure if this is smart, but that's just the way that I've done it for this project. So that's a big difference. In Seaside, if you have an option field like item, GL account, resource, or fixed assets, it's called option string. In Visual Studio Code, it's called an option member. It's one of the differences. VS Code also has real-time compiling. Translation is different. In Seaside, we have translation in objects, and VS Code, we can do translation outside of the objects. And in Seaside, we have the symbol menu. Symbol menu is still with us in a code unit or an object. You can just press F5 and you get the symbol menu. Symbol menu doesn't exist anymore in VS Code. Maybe someone will create an extension for it. But in VS Code, you actually have to hit Control Space to see what you can do in VS Code to see what options you have. If I just quickly go into the virtual machine, and if I hit Control Space here, you can see that in this place of my object, I can actually do all of these things. This is the page properties, and this is where I can set a page to be editable, right? So those are big differences, right? These are things that we have to get used to. So in order to do today's webinars, my idea was to just convert some code and to see what the differences are. Microsoft is shipping a conversion tool, which is called txt to al.xt. If you get your hands on the product DVD when the product is released, or if you have access to the CTP builds, you can go to your Windows folder, you can go to Program Files x86, NAV 1110, rotated client, and here all the way at the end, you have txt to al.exe and txt al converter.dll. It doesn't make sense to copy these files into...
Mark.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to interrupt just for a second because we had something from the audience that I think might be pertinent. It says you can get the AL VSIX from Docker and use locally. I am able to use CPT16. Okay, all right. As long as
and I'm actually I'm actually doing that right now. I just created a new November update, but it was not in time to make it work for today's presentation.
Okay.
So
and to the person that's asking about a recording, the answer is yes. They're having a little trouble. So okay.
Sure. So the txt to the al.exe and the DLL, one would probably be tempted to say, hey, I want those two files in a local folder. So you may be tempted to say, hey, I have a working folder here, and I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to work with them here. That doesn't work because the exe file has a dependency on the DLLs from NAV. So you can actually not just copy and paste it around. It has to be inside of this folder in order to work, otherwise it won't work. So what I've done is I've created a really simple MS-DOTS batch file that does the conversion. The syntax for the conversion is in the PowerPoint slides as well. You can also use PowerShell if you are working on Docker, but like I said, we have to walk before we can run. So this is how it works behind the scenes, and the PowerShell is probably just calling the convert the txt to al.exe anyway. So this is how it works. You call the finsql.exe. You call a command which is called export to new syntax. Then you give it a file name. You point it to the database because the finsql.exe goes directly into the SQL Server database. It needs to know the SQL Server service name. Which files do you want to export? And if you want, you can create a log file. This is something that one of my students came up with when we did a little workshop on this, and this will actually show you any error messages because the finsql.exe is not really good in giving error messages, and if you do something wrong, the log file will just tell you what you did wrong. Then we're going to just break the command, and then we are going to run txt to al, and we're going to use the source folder and the target folder, and we're going to tell it to rename the files. So what I've done is I have a database with some basic objects. I have a setup table. The setup table is the setup table that we all know and love. It has a primary key, which is a code 10 field. Then it just has a Boolean field, and it has some number series. We all know that in NAV, if you want to change stuff, you have to go to the property window and you have to set the properties. I'm not sure if everyone is aware of this, but the NAV development environment, Seaside, is actually developed for non-developers. It's created for non-developers. The original target audience that Navision had with Seaside was that it should be able for accountants to make changes to an ERP system. So the audience for Seaside never was professional developers. The audience for Seaside always was accountants. And that's one of the reasons why in NAV you have to click through so many windows to set properties and do stuff. It's basically like using NAV as an end user as well. So we have the setup table. We also have a master data table. The master data table has a number field, a name field, It has an option string blocked, and the option string has shipped, invoice, and all. It has a couple of other tables. It has a bunch of pages. Example setup. This has a general tab and a numbering tab, like most of the setup pages have in NAV. And we have a person card, and the person card has a general tab and a communication tab. This is basically how we have been creating master data pages for a very long time. We also have a simple codeunit in this example application. We have a codeunit that finds a price. So this codeunit has an on-run trigger, but we don't use the on-run trigger, and it has a function get sales price. This solution also has some fields in standard NAV tables. So we have created a field called example enabled, and this field is referenced in another codeunit. So this codeunit is actually referencing the user setup table with the example enabled flag, right? So what we can do is we can actually run the txt2al exe file, and let's actually do that. Let's check if all the folders are empty. We're going to delete this file, and we're going to delete these files. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run the conversion tool. Let's go back to program files and run good old MS-DOS to see how all of this is working. It actually created the export file. If I now go into my folder AL, you can see that my error file is there, and it says that the command has successfully completed. And now I'm going to run the conversion tool, and the conversion tool actually creates the AL objects, right? So what we can do now first is we can actually compare the objects that we have just created to the original file. Let's have a quick look at the original file. This is my export file. And you can see that my export file actually looks a lot like the text files that we used to have in NAV for a long time. The export file is not that much different from a normal export file. It's just a couple of minor changes that Microsoft has added to this in order to make the conversion tool works. What I've actually done in order to prepare for this webinar is I have created a compare folder, and here in my compare folder I have my table 50,000, and I have my table 50,000 from AL. And what I can actually do is I can compare these two objects, and here I can see, let's actually swap sides. On the left side, we have the C-side object. This is the good old NAV text object. And here we have VS Code, right? So you can see that the order is a little bit different. What I actually have to do is I have to fiddle around a little bit with aligning. I actually have to align fields with fields. And then you can see that actually VS Code has the same syntax, almost the same syntax as we used to have with C-side. But the syntax has changed a little bit in the sense that it says field number 1 primary key. It doesn't have all the spaces, but you can really see that the VS Code syntax is inspired on the old NAV text files. We also have keys. Every table needs at least a primary key which is clustered. You can see that the structure of creating a key in Visual Studio Code is almost the same as creating a key in C-side. We have some code here as well. The code here is in its setup record. And you can see that in C-side we have begin, end, and in uppercase. And here we have the same syntax in lowercase, but that's basically all of the differences. One of the things which is changing, which you can say is good or bad, I don't know. The modified flag is going to change, and the date and the timestamp. Those guys are gone. You cannot just go into Visual Studio Code and filter on all objects which are modified. You have to use version control. VS Code is natively integrated with Git, so that's why Camille is going to do a webinar on that. If you have a version list, the version list is converted into a comment, right? So the version list is always converted into a comment. You can actually add comments anywhere in your C-side object and in your VS Code object where you want to have the comment for your object. Let's look at the setup page as well. So here we have the page 50,000, and let's actually compare those and see what the differences are here. Here we have the C-side page, and here we have the VS Code page. Again, here we have to do a little bit of fiddling around in order to make the aligning work. If we align delete allowed with delete allowed, you can actually see that here we have the properties, and the properties are here in the page in Visual Studio Code. Again, date, time, modified has been deleted, and the version list is converted into an option string. And then we have controls, and controls is something that we can align with layout. And then we can see that here we have the general tab, and we have the general tab here as well. Here we have the numbering tab, and here we have the numbering tab. And you can see that here we have the field, which is created, and here we also have a field which is created. Fact boxes are a little bit different. Here we have an area with fact boxes. These are system parts with record links and notes. And it's not called a container anymore. It's called an area with fact boxes. And it simply maps to system part with a weird number and then links and then notes. And last but not least, we have a trigger. And the trigger, for whatever reason, is moved from the top of the page definition, where we have if not get, then init insert, into the bottom of the page, right? But you can really see that the code that we have in Visual Studio Code is inspired on the old text files, and you can take all the existing code that you ever created in C-side, and you can convert it into AL code and make it work like this. The last two objects that I wanted to compare before we go into some other stuff that I want to cover today is the master data table. We have table 5010 and 5010. Let's compare those objects as well. Here we have the example person table, and let's actually align fields with fields. You can see that actually it's not that much of a change, and the most interesting fact, and I think you have noticed it in the previous two comparisons as well, all of the metadata is changed a little bit, not that much, it's just cleaned up, but all of the code is always the same, right? Beyond compare makes the properties red, but the code is always blue, and blue and beyond compare means it's not changed, only the indenting is different, the spacing is different. And that's one of the really important requirements from Microsoft, is that CAL and AL are not that much different. There's really, really, really small differences, but they are almost not noticeable, right? The coding, all the coding that you have learned in the last 20 years, or maybe longer or shorter with Navision, you can still use with VS Code. One of the most interesting changes, and I actually don't know why they changed it, but it's a change, is that an option string becomes an option member. Maybe because string is a reserved word. I don't know why they made that change, but for some reason they felt that option strings had to become option members, and that's why I wanted to show this specific example. And the last thing I want to show you is the code unit. So here we have a code unit. Let's go into blah 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 blah, where we have it. Product price management, this code unit. Let's compare it.
Mark, we're also having questions about the what happens to the reports with the RDLC layout. So if you want to try cover that too.
Let's see if we have time for that. Yeah. Let's see if we have time for that. And otherwise, we'll do a dedicated webinar for reports because it's actually quite. You have to do a workaround to make that work. So it actually deserves another webinar, I think. So here we have a code unit, and the code unit is actually the object type that has the least amount of changes. Most of the code units move forward one-to-one. Again, uppercase to lowercase. Procedure is the keyword that has been used in Navision forever. The metadata has always been functions, but now we go back to the good old Pascal terminology, which is a procedure. The numbers for the variables have been removed. That's fixed by VS Code internally. But code units are almost identical. All of your business logic that you have in functions in code units will be mapped one-to-one. Again, date, time, modified is gone, and everything else is converted into comments. Anyway, if you have comments in your objects, by the way, I'd never do comments in my objects, but if you have comments in your objects, the comments are also converted into comments, just like the version list, right? So if you don't use version control with Seaside and you still use comments, they are converted to those guys. So now we actually have something that we can start using with a Visual Studio Code project. We actually have our converted AL code. And what we can actually do is we can go into Visual Studio Code. And now I'm going to move to my virtual machine. And here in Visual Studio Code, I can start a new project by saying AL go. And I can say, okay, this is my webinar demo. Let's remove the space. No, I don't want to save that. It's a local server. Yeah, I know. And the first thing we have to fix is the launch.json and the app.json file. I'm just going to quickly steal that. This may go a little bit fast, but I'm just going to fix my launch.json file just to get an option to download my packages. So now I have a clean project that is connected to my Azure machine. And what I can do now is I can go into my PC, and my PC is mapped to my local files on my local machine. And here we have our AL folder. And what we can actually do is we can copy all of these files. And now in Visual Studio Code, we can say reveal in Explorer. And in our Explorer, we have our webinar demo. And here we can simply paste the files. And now all of the dark magic should happen. Now the compiler will actually pick it up automatically. That's one of the big differences between Visual Studio Code and Seaside. In VS Code, the compiler will immediately start kicking in and explain us what the problems are. And the first problem that we see is the identifier 50011 is not valid. And that's because in my app.json file, I have to tell the compiler which ID to use for my little project. And in this case, I'm just going to say anything for the normal modification range is accepted. And now the compiler immediately say everything is just fine with my object pages. And now I can actually go further, and now it will say, in this code unit, the user setup table is missing. This is because there is no reference yet to the original objects. Normally in C-side, if I code anything in C-side, all of the objects are there. Everything is in one big thing. And with an extension, you're loosely coupling your code to the base app. So you have to tell it where the base app is. And you do that with your packages. You can actually download symbols. And if you download the symbols, it will actually go to your C-side database, and it will actually grab reference to your original database, and you will get these packages. And these packages will tell the system which original objects to compile to, and all of a sudden the other problems are fixed as well. So the only problem we have left is in the user setup. Remember, we have created this example enabled field, but we did not convert that field, right? If we look at the conversion, in the conversion we only focused on the objects that we created ourselves. This is going to be a challenge. How do you actually add those fields? And for this, you can take two approaches. You can actually leave those fields in C-side and create your own package file, and I'll explain how to do that in a minute. Or you can create table extensions that contain these fields. These table extensions is a new object type in VS Code. It's based on the good old Delta files that we had with extensions v1. The AL converter allows you to convert from Delta files to an extension. But that is a tedious process, because that means that you first have to create an extension version 1 in order to convert your code in extension version 2. And I'm just going to show you quickly the syntax for that table extension. The syntax for that table extension is, let's go to my recent folders, AL test, don't save. And here I have a table extension. This is the table extension, right? This is the table extension that adds the example enabled field to the table. So currently, with the knowledge that I have today, my recommendation would probably be just quickly create these table extensions manually. Maybe somebody will come up with a much smarter idea and put it on a blog, and that will be the recommended way of going. But currently, that would be what I would do, I think. Right? It's very easy to do that. And actually, what I can do now is I can actually copy this guy, and I can actually paste it in this project, and then these compile errors would be different. We have a few minutes left before we have to go into Q&A. It's amazing how time flies if you do a webinar like that. I wanted to cover so much more in this webinar. I want to focus a little bit on making changes to NAV objects, right? Normally, if we get a question from a customer and the customer says, hey, can you make the sales line do this and that when somebody changes the item number, right? Now we can just go in here and we can say, oh, we have the function copy from item. And here we have this line of code. And here I'm just going to say description 2 is crap, right? So now description 2 will always contain crap if I use any item from the database. Well, this is still going to work in NAV 2018 if you want. NAV 2018 is hybrid. So in NAV 2018, you can modify base objects if you want. And you can separate your extension into an extension if you want to do that. But of course, from C-side, you cannot reference to the extension code, right? So how would you approach that? First of all, let me explain to you how to create your own package file. And I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint for that. This is a link to the Microsoft page that currently describes running hybrid, running C-side and AL side by side. What we are going to get is a command, finsql.exe, and it says command generate symbol reference, and then a database name, and then a server name. This already kind of works, but not really in CTP16. If I go to CTP16 and I go into my Navision folder and I go into my convert, maybe I'm doing something wrong. If anyone in the audience knows what I'm doing wrong, then please go ahead. But I'm actually running this, this line of code. And if I run this line of code, it's going to generate the symbols based on my current state of Seaside. So if I go into the sales line and if I add a field to the sales line, 50,000, my package file will contain that field, right? And this is kind of, if you ask for my opinion, where the danger zone starts, because what are you going to put in Seaside and what are you going to put in extensions? I would personally say that put as much in extensions as possible, except, right? Except if you need .NET, except if you need files, except if it's a shitload of work and you just need to go live and you'll do it later. But it also means that, for example, you can create your own events. So if I go back to my previous example, I can go into my number field and I can go to my item table, and here I can just go into my functions and say, well, let's go here, my cool event, and I'm going to say that this guy is an event publisher, and I'm going to raise my cool event, right? Just put it here. And now I can subscribe to this event just for this customer, right? This is what you can do if you run hybrid. I hope all of this made a little bit of sense. It was in general what I was trying to approach with this. Joe, Julia, anything that I missed, anything that was unclear, any questions? Or do you want to go into reports and try to cover reports? We have 15 minutes left until we are at the top of the hour.
Well, I have two questions, and one I answered, I thought, but then I reread it, and it's asking about, is there a walkthrough on how to set up Visual Studio Code Nav 2018 in Docker? And I think if you set up the Docker, that you can get 2018, and then there's one more line of PowerShell code to set up Visual Studio Code.
Yeah,
and
that's
I think Waldo did a pretty good job of explaining that on his blog.
Yeah, and I'm actually I've been too busy in the last couple of weeks preparing my NAV Tech Days session next week about Power Apps, which I never realized how much work that would be to actually make myself comfortable with Power Apps. So I actually haven't looked at Docker. There's so many hours in a day, and I don't know anything about Docker, so I couldn't answer that question.
The other one is there's how can we expand a standard option field with a new option value and then use that in a case statement?
Yeah, so currently you have to do that in Seaside. It's one of the reasons why we are hybrid. It's just not going to work. It's on the roadmap, but currently there's no way to do that with an extension. Yeah, it's one of the most frequently done changes, right? You go into the sales line type field and you add a bunch of commas. Everybody adds the same amount of commas, of course, and then you say, okay, we have a new one. I think in one of my books, I think it was the application design book, I think in one of my books I actually described that you could actually create a new type field, my type, and in the page override the page type field. That actually works in Seaside as well. I never tried to do this with an extension, but that would kind of destroy the whole concept of running extensions by side, right?
Yeah. And it looks like Tobias is answering how to get the Docker.
Oh yeah, he would know. He would know that.
Yeah.
That's why you're going to do a webinar, Tobias. So, yeah. Sometimes it's very hard to create a logical order in all of these webinars. Probably, maybe it would have made sense to do a Docker webinar before this one, but that's just the way it was scheduled.
Mark, this is Julia. The extensions are there's going to be a new version of extensions coming out soon. Will that be in the spring, or is that coming out in December?
No, it's going to be in 22 days. In
22
December.
days. Okay.
22 days. Yep. Everything I showed you today is going to be available in December 1st. That's what they said. Yep. And it's going to be interesting to see how all of this stuff is being picked up, how many people will go hybrid, how many people will stay in Seaside. I think part of the stuff has to be done in Seaside because simply extensions is not completely feature complete, but it is 90% feature complete.
There's a question out here. Is there a relationship between Nav 2018 and Dynamics 365, and can they use the 2018 extensions on D365?
No, not always. And I actually played around a little bit today with one of the things that I bumped into is that the AL language extension that you download from the Visual Studio Code Marketplace is version 9. And version 9 is what Microsoft currently uses for Dynamics 365. And NAV 2018 is currently on the AL extension version 11. So I would guess that extensions are mostly going to be compatible between, but not guaranteed to be compatible.
Hmm. Let's see if I understand it correctly. Then on release of NAV 2018 and D360, the 2018 and D365 should be the same, says Tobias. We're getting a question on, is net support on the roadmap of extensions V2? And
can you repeat that? Net support?
Is .NET support also on the roadmap of extensions V2?
Microsoft told me that it's on a roadmap, but it's not going to be in the December release.
Okay.
And I think Tobias means that eventually Dynamics 365 and NAV 18 will be the same, but it's not going to be the same in December.
Right. Getting a question about a technical upgrade from 2016 to 2017 and put it on 2018 and then use the extensions on the...
That is something that I am going to try. I have a customer that has a country version for Lithuania and Romania, and I'm going to try to make that run with extensions, but I want to wait until NAV 2018 is officially available to try that. So I'm not sure yet if that's going to work. I don't know why not. I don't know why not, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
Mark, I think your webinar is extremely helpful. And as I'm watching it, I'm thinking, you know, an hour, as you said, is, you know, just the tip of the iceberg kind of thing. And so I'm thinking, well, where can I send programmers to, you know, for a week or for whatever length of time where they can just get all this information, they can actually do it with an instructor. Is there such a thing? Do you do that? Are there other...
I am not doing that at the moment, and I'm not considering that either. I know that the Cloud Ready Software guys, Arend Jan and Waldo, they have done some sessions. I'm not sure if they are on the call, if they can actually tell us in the question window if they have anything available yet. I don't know if Microsoft is going to come out with official training materials, so that would be a question that I cannot answer. I am not going to do any workshops on this. I'm just sharing what I know.
And boy, do we appreciate it. Thank you.
We have another question. I'm not really sure what you're asking. It's asking about the posting process and how data is organized. Will that be changed? And I know that they've revamped the posting code units and they've totally redone those. But as far as what actually happens and where the data is going, I don't think that they actually changed that. They just cleaned up a bunch of code that was written out there.
Code unit 80 and 90 have been refactored in NAV 2018. But refactoring, but refactoring means just moving code around, not really refactoring. If you ask what I would like, I would really like them to completely refactor it, and I have a strong opinion on how they should do it. But it's not going to happen. And I think one of the reasons why it will actually never happen is that with extensions, Microsoft is going to go to an object-oriented model where an extension is going to take a dependency on the original, on the master objects. And if Microsoft will refactor after they have released extensions, all extensions will break. Right? So refactoring from Microsoft is going to be even more difficult after they have done extensions. Right? So it's going to be really hard. I think Navision will be like it is for a long time. You don't have to worry about relearning the posting routines.
Okay, we have another question, and then he says, if we have code in NAV 2017, we need to recode everything on Dynamics 365. And I'm not sure if you're asking about the extensions and then trying to get something up to the App Store or what. But if you're trying to submit an extension as an app to the App Store, right now they'll still let you use the extensions version 1, but they're trying to push everybody to do extensions v2 for D365.
Yeah, and I know people have been trying to make Navision do what they should not have done in the first place, and those kinds of stuff will never be an extension. And for that, Microsoft is looking into, and I have no idea what the status of that is, but they have been talking about these embedded apps where large ISVs are able to hack Navision just the way they want it. And they are not supported by Microsoft anymore, and it's this white labeling story.
Yeah.
But there's just a whole bunch of rumors about that, and I don't know the final outcome. And we'll probably hear more about that when Tenerife is getting closer. But if you've done stuff to Navision that you should have never done, then the extensions is not going to work for you.
Okay, another question about using the VSC in local. Can you download the VSIX file from the compiler from the Azure virtual machine?
Yes, and Waldo actually blogged that. If we go to Waldo's blog, which of course should be on everyone's shortcut list, Waldo actually describes here how to do that with PowerShell and Docker. But like I said, this is currently, for me, it's outside of my comfort zone. But it is possible to get the VSIX file outside of the Docker image.
Okay. Another one is the VSC extension v9 used for D365. Does that mean you can only develop D365 in the AL language? And I think the answer for that is going to be yes.
Yeah. And I don't think it will be long until Microsoft will retire Seaside. Maybe 2 years, and then it's bye-bye Seaside, just like bye-bye Classic Client and bye-bye native database.
Licensing of new table page extension objects. Does the customer need extra 50,000 range objects?
Yeah, I'm not aware that Microsoft is going to charge for table extensions and page extensions. Just like queries, I expect those objects to be free. Pages, tables, code units are going to be traditionally licensed, so you still have to buy those. What is interesting, though, is I think Application Builder and Solution Developer will be retired, because I don't think Microsoft can prevent anyone from just creating an extension, because it's text files. So I think those really expensive granules that prevented end users from programming I think those will be retired, but I'm not 100% sure. But the compiler is not aware who is actually creating the code. In C-side, you could actually prevent people from pushing the design button, but in Visual Studio Code, it's a text file, so you cannot prevent people from creating text files.
Okay.
It's a brainwave. Sorry.
Another question about the roadmap, and are they going to be moving the country releases to extensions? That's kind of another.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but not now. I think what I've read is Danish localization has been partly moved to an extension, and I think NAV 2018 will still have local versions in C-side, and the plan for the future is to move localizations to extensions. Yes, everything is going to be extensions. The base app will in the future also be an extension of nothing, an extension of nothing. I mean, something has to start, right? But C-side will retire. But not today.
Can we add publisher functions in the table extension, and how can we add this publisher function within existing lines of code?
So you want to publish, publish an extension in VS Code. You can actually do that. I should have an example of that somewhere over here. If you go to my GitHub, and I just updated it today for the latest build. If you go to my GitHub, there's an AL example extension. And this example extension contains pretty much everything you can do with extensions, even reports. And in this example, I also have a event publisher, but I don't know where it is. It's this codeunit. And Rick is warning me that we're getting into the top of the hour, so we have to wrap up.
Yeah, we're at 1 minute.
Yeah. Yeah, this is an event, a business event. So this is an event publisher. So this is the way to publish an event in VS Code. And events can have dependencies on them on other extensions can have dependencies on extensions. Extensions are, if you're familiar with C#, they are like NuGet packages, like DLLs, and you can just stack them together and create dependencies. And we're just going to have to see what the best practices are around that.
Okay. I think that's our time, though.
I think it's our time. Yeah, Rick is telling us that we have to wrap up. Any last question? Something that stands out?
I just want to say thank you, Mark, for
Everything
sharing.
is outstanding. Well done.
Yes.
Yeah. And thank you for asking, because without questions about which webinar we'll do, we have no idea what people are interested in. And this is, I mean, this was a record turnout. We had more than 300 people sign up and more than 200 people appear, and it has never been more than that. So, Julia, thank you for asking for this webinar.
All right. Very good.
Let's wrap up.
And thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.